In our last video, we went through the project structure of a Jigx project. In this section, we're going to do much less talking and much more building. So let's look at a jig. Remember, we talked about a jig being where we lay out the visual components. So here's a very simple hello world jig. Let's have a quick look through it. Starting at the top, we can see the metadata for the jig, which basically describes the jig. The next section down is a header, which allows us to put a nice visual image at the top of our jig. The data source describes, in this case, the data that we're going to need to drive the list, and a list could be one or more items. In this instance, it's going to be a single item. And then finally, we have the list itself, which has the data on line 26 pointing to the data source, and then the configuration of the item, which in this instance has a title and a subtitle. As we explore further sections, we'll see how we can enrich in the list experience and add many, many more elements to it. All right, let's go ahead and build this jig from scratch. So to build the jig from scratch, the first thing we're going to do is go and add a new file, hello world.jigs. We'll see immediately that IntelliSense is provided by the Jigx add-in. In this case, we can go ahead and select the list jig. That is the jig that we're going to use for our hello world. That will immediately scaffold out the jig that we just looked at. So let's name this. We'll call this hello world. We'll give this a description. This is our first jig. It's a list. We will use the Apple icon instead of this. And I do this specifically to show you how you invoke IntelliSense. So to invoke IntelliSense, you can use Control plus Spacebar. In this case, I'm going to use the Apple icon. The Jigx header, which is the visual image, we can leave as is. Just note on line 14, you can point that to any image available on the internet. Clearly useful for any company branding or application branding. We don't need the on focus event. I'm going to get rid of that. We'll come back to that in a later video. We do need to configure a data source for the jig. So let's go ahead and do that. Control Spacebar gives us a choices again. In this instance, we want a static data source. Again, it'll configure for us. We can say in our record, field 1 is going to be hello, and field 2, we're going to just use world. That'll give us our hello world example. We are now going to go ahead in line 25 and configure our list. So line 25 is the data that is required to drive that list. You'll see that the my data here refers to line 17, where the data source is defined. And then it's just about configuring the list item. Here we can basically point that list item to our data. So again, we have IntelliSense. So this is going to be field 1, and this will be field 2. And again, we can use our IntelliSense. We've completed configuration of the jig. All we need to do now is go ahead and build it and make one addition to the index file, which will describe how the application is laid out. To complete our application, we just need to configure the index file, which essentially lays out the application for us. So we know that we're going to use widgets. We'll describe this in more detail in a later video, but let's go ahead and just configure our simple hello world example. We'll use Control Spacebar. We know that we want a widget. We want a very simple widget here, 1 by 1, and we're going to point that at our hello world example that we just configured. That's it. We are complete with our application. We can now publish it and start playing with it. Brilliant. We've completed our app. If you open the app, it'll look like this. And if you press on the Apple icon here, you can see your hello world app. Congratulations. You've finished your first app. Let's move on.